Welcome to episode 42 of Communicast, a communication skills podcast. I'm Scott D'Amico, president of Communispond, a global communication skills training organization. Focus on your audience and use stories. That is the key advice from my guest, Rob Lauber. Rob is a career learning and development executive for brands such as McDonald's, Yum, and Cingular Wireless. He is also the founder and CEO of XLO Global, where he helps learning teams drive more business value. In this episode, we talk about the importance of focusing on your audience, how to use stories to convey your message, and being confident that you don't know something. I hope you enjoy. Rob, thank you so much for joining me today. Really looking forward to our conversation.
Scott, really happy to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Before we jump too deep into this, Rob, why don't you maybe tell the listeners a little bit about you, your career journey, and the exciting stuff that you are working on today?
Yeah, so I'm a 30-year veteran in learning and development, so 30 plus. I think this is actually year 33 now. And I spent most of my career building and running learning and development organizations and companies you'd recognize. Like most recently, I retired from McDonald's in 2020. I was a chief learning officer there. Before that, I was a chief learning officer at Yum Brands, which is KFC, Pizza Hut, and Taco Bell. Before that, Cingular Wireless helped start that up and then close that down as AT&T ingested it back into the Bell system. And, I've been around all kinds of learning and development, particularly emphasis on frontline and those types of things based on the nature of those businesses. And I retired in 2020, and I've been doing work on two fronts, really, working with startups, trying to help the supplier community connect better into enterprises and people like I used to be, and spend their time more wisely in terms of trying to sell into organizations. And then secondly, I still do quite a bit of consulting in organizations, helping them figure out learning strategy. There's been a lot of disruption over the last couple of years, and people are definitely trying to figure that one out. And as the economy shifts and changes, that change seems to be constant these days.
Exactly. I think the old saying goes, the only thing that is constant is the change. So if you think about the seismic shifts that we had for the past 3 years, really with work, and a big part of that is how do you develop and train your employees, and a really big part of that, the frontline employees during that time of change. And then now really looking at what's going on with the global economy, what will be next for organizations and their development and attracting and retaining employees. So very exciting time to be in this space. And just as I look through your background and your resume, you really just the who's who of who you'd want to work for. And with the McDonald's and the Yum Brands, I'm glad I had lunch because my stomach would be rumbling right now just thinking about that. But so thank you for sharing a little bit about the background for context. And I would think, Rob, throughout that journey, you've had the opportunity to hear from some amazing and inspirational communicators. So if you think about that, or if you hear this term, somebody's a great communicator or they're an inspiring communicator, what's the vision that comes to mind for you?
Yeah, I think it's people that know how to connect to their audience, right? So, so there's the trick with communications, of course, is always, is what the sender intent, what the receiver hears. And I think that, the best communicators really know how to do that in a variety of different ways. By one, understanding probably the audience and the sentiment, particularly of the audience that they're trying to speak to. I think two, so they demonstrate some empathy. I think two, depending on the mode that they do that in, they tend to be good storytellers as well. Right. Although in an email, a storytelling might drown people out because it's too much text. But in a physical or virtual presence, I think storytelling is super important, and being able to do that really well is super important. So I think it's that connection and how that comes through in terms of like empathy, really understanding, and then second, being able to storytell in a way that people can connect and that you can get your point across.
I really appreciate that you led with the audience, really focusing in on trying to make that connection with the audience. I think that's where a lot of people stumble in their communications. They go into it, whether it is an email or keynote presentation or maybe a presentation they have to give to their board or their team, a lot of times they're going into it with their mindset. What's this information that I have to get out? What's my intent? What are my goals? And they don't spend enough time or sometimes any time really thinking about that audience and how to best tailor the message to the audience. As I'm sure if you're delivering a presentation or delivering a message to the C-suite at a Fortune 500 organization, much different than going to a keynote at a big industry conference, and then different to communicating something at an organization that has tens or hundreds of thousands of frontline employees. So really thinking about that audience is key. And then, yeah, as you're able to bring in stories, they're so powerful. They just really help to connect with people. And I think connect sometimes complex and disparate information. If you can bring it together with the story, that's typically where the magic happens.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, and storytelling can sound intimidating to people that aren't necessarily particularly feel that they're particularly skilled at it. But really, it can be as simple as just providing examples, right?
Mm-hmm.
Examples that people can relate to, particularly as you're trying to tie complex ideas together and get people to take action. For example, simple examples really work well in showing people what it looks like when it's in action, or what it is that what your point is that you're trying to get across, what it looks like when it's happening.
That's a key point when you talk about stories. Is sometimes people can be intimidated by that. Oftentimes there's two perceptions of storytelling. One is that somebody is just indeed a great storyteller. You really like listening to their stories if they're talking about their life or a trip that they went on. They really know how to pull the audience in. But the other aspect of that I think is really more relevant to the corporate workplace is, how do you use examples? How do you use those experiences to try and pull people together to get a good understanding? And sometimes it's a metaphor, an analogy, or a true example where, hey, I was working with this team and we did X, Y, and Z. Here's why I think that can work over here. So I think really looking at storytelling from both perspectives is important.
Yeah, and I think that concept of relatability in that story or that example becomes critical, right? Because if you're disconnected from that audience, and I think to your earlier comment, it's easy for everyone to figure out their intent. It's really hard to figure out how everyone's going to receive it. And so I think thinking about that other side and how it is going to be received is critical. And so thinking even about the story you're going to tell or the example you're going to use, and making sure that people can really relate to it,
Mm-hmm.
is super important. And I think that's to your point of where, if you're talking to people in restaurants or you're talking to a board of directors, the relatability construct is completely different.
It all goes back to the audience, right? Understand the audience, what's important to them, what's likely to connect to them. That's powerful. Thank you, Rob.
Sure.
Rob, with the work that you're doing today and really throughout your career, what are you seeing? And I'm sure it's changed quite a bit over the past 3 years, but really, what are some of those skills, particularly the soft skills, that are really important in the workplace today that companies are either doing very well with and they're succeeding, or perhaps there's that gap that they're trying to figure out for their employees?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. Like the past few years, I think the digital communication space has really taken off as being sort of a method, even the way we're doing this today, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So I think that a couple things are happening that are shifting probably the way people need to think about how they communicate. One is the availability of video is much more sort of ubiquitous, right? So being able to do these things where you and I are in completely different places and completely different spaces, but we can have a great conversation, I think are super important, and thinking about that in a construct of a face-to-face conversation. I think secondly, the proliferation now of instant messaging tools and group collaboration platforms, and and of course email, means you have to be pretty versatile in your way and how you think about communicating, because in those more let's say just straight text-based formats, you have to be super clear on making sure that people understand your intention, right? All the
Yes.
nonverbals go away, right? So, a coaching comment might not seem like a coaching comment, might seem like you're being chastised, and so I think being super clear on intent of what you're trying to say on those platforms becomes really important. And I think also being, as a receiver, I think being open-minded to the intent as well is super important. So how do you always trust in positive intentions of the people that you might be receiving messaging from, particularly if it's feedback? And then how do you think about asking, for more clarity, right? And even if you're the communicator and people are asking you then questions, asking for clarity and clarification around what it is that they're thinking or what it is that they're hearing from you is probably super important in that construct, right? I think the video piece is probably easier because people can see facial expressions and tone of voice and those kind of things. I think are still like critically important, but probably more natural for most of us.
A lot of great stuff there to unpack. And if I think about the text base or email, text messages, it's amazing what a simple exclamation point can perhaps completely change how the receiver interprets that message, or just putting a smiley face emoji in there for those people that like to use emojis or too many. We've all heard the stories before of people typing in all caps or getting a message and being irate when they read it and then responding and being, oh, I think I misread that or misinterpreted the intent. So I love what you said there from the receiver's perspective. It's important to go in that with, I think you said, like kind of an open mind and really looking at things through the best light possible, the positive light first, and then if need be, go back and ask for that clarification rather than being upset and shutting down. Hey, just what can you help me a little bit more? What did you mean by that? Can you provide me some additional context? Is absolutely huge. And I think it would have saved a lot of careers if people would do that. And what I found so interesting over the past few years with video is just the acceleration of the acceleration of people being willing to do business without having met face to face. 3 years ago, it was kind of getting there. 5 years ago, still people were wanting to sit down with you, meet with you first, typically face to face, before you do some sort of partnership or relationship or a sale or something like that. But now with everything over the past several years, it's really accelerated that. And I don't see us going back fully that way. The whole hybrid work thing aside, just from doing business with organizations fundamentally has changed.
Yeah, I think you're spot on there. It's interesting. These platforms are 25 years old. So, the things, Zoom particularly is not 25 years old, but this ability to do what we're doing right here is started in the late 90s. And, so it's not like it just suddenly appeared in the pandemic and became a way of business. To your point, I think it just became more mainstream and more acceptable as a way to do it. But I'll give you a good example of how you communicate with emojis or not or whatever. I asked one of my kids a question and they responded back and they gave me what I needed and I replied back, thanks, with the period. And I got a ton of feedback from my kids that that's a passive aggressive response. And I was like, what are you talking about? Right. My intent was like, thank you. You answered my question. And so, so asking for more information about like, what are you talking about? How does that show up? How am I coming across passive aggressive in this way? And they're like, well, actually the period on the end. Right. And it's just things I didn't really, something I'd never think of. I'm like, well, I'm grammatically correct. And they're like, no, actually you're passive aggressive. And so, again, sort of intent and reception and, the people on the other end receiving that message look at it completely differently maybe than you do. And just really, I think getting that feedback was great because I was like, thanks. What do I need to do to change? Teach the old man. And then, second, it's just a good reminder too, that you don't necessarily know how it's being received on the other end. Something as simple as a thanks.
Yeah, I have a 10-year-old and a 13-year-old, so I am routinely getting schooled on the technology and the communication channels and things like that. Then you layer that into the workforce where now this multi-generational workforce where so many people communicate in different ways, have preferred methods of communications, where somebody's going to take that thanks period as passive aggressive. Somebody's not going to think anything of it. I know I do that all the time. For me, It's like a little pet. I always put the period in, but Yeah, it is being aware. Gosh, always goes back to this idea of audience, understanding your audience and knowing who you're sending it to and starting to think about how will this be received? What might be some of the pushback? What might be some of the questions or concerns from sending this message?
Yeah, and I can think about some of the, across my career, there have always been sort of trusted people on my team that I've been able to take messages and preview them with them and ask them for commentary, like, so how can I improve this? What's not clear? What else should I be thinking about? What are the 5 questions people might have from what I'm about to say? Those kind of things in terms of, so in order to be maybe more concise, more thorough, and more relatable. I think that, that I put that all in the sphere of sort of empathy, but I think that that's all super important.
And I would say one last thing that I would piggyback on for people to think about with the audience is also what's going on at your organization during the time that you're sending this. So if things are calm, things are stable, steady, and you send out a calendar invite with quick team update, people might not think much about that. But if you're going through a reorg or there's, maybe there's recently been layoffs or there's, challenges going on within your company and you send out something very short without a whole lot of details, without the information, without enough communication, people are going to fill in the blanks on their own. So always be mindful as when you're communicating with people, especially during times of change or trying times at the organization, really this importance to over communicate. And it's sometimes you might break norms of how maybe you would send out a calendar invite or send out an email. Just kind of always think about how will this be received. And I've had that in my career before where there was lots of change going on, lots of restructure, lots of reorgs, and we would get this, all department calendar invite for the next day that says couple of updates. And everyone just is like immediately starts thinking, what's going on? What's going to happen? Are they doing another change? So just kind of take the time to think, how will this be received?
No, I think that's right. You lose a day of productivity in those situations, right?
Yeah.
Just because everybody's worried about what's going to be. And I think that's where, providing context becomes really important. So, for example, if you're going to communicate that you want to do a team update the next day, and it's not about maybe some pending activity that's going on in the business or the environment that feels like some pending activity is going on, maybe you can include a few bullet points which describe exactly what it is that you want to talk about, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, how are we going to work going forward? Here's 3 projects that are stymieing us at the moment, and what do we need to do to turn them around? Things that sort of take that uncertainty off the table become super important that way as well, I think.
Right. Because the extra 30 seconds maybe that it takes you to write that context could save, depending on the size of your team and organization, hundreds, if not thousands of hours of lost productivity because people are nervous and calling each other and sending Slack messages trying to figure out what's going on.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the last thing you probably need in situations like that, because usually your business is being challenged and you need greater productivity, not less. So,
Absolutely. Rob, as you think of or think through your career journey, if you had to point to one or maybe two key communication skills that have really helped you get to the pinnacle of your industry and continue on now with the consulting work that you're doing, what would you say those skills would be?
it's a good question. I think 2 things. Here's what people would say, maybe is a better way as opposed to what I would say. I think that I have a fairly direct communication styles, and that might sound negative, but direct in the context of I try to be concise and as clear as I possibly can in my communications. So trying to keep the message simple, trying to keep it direct, trying to again make sure it's relatable, casual when it needs to be. Those kind of things I think is one. And then the second one is trying to come across confidently. So, and sometimes that confidence might even be expressed in the way of, here's things I don't understand that I need to learn more about, right? So I'm confident that I don't know something, right?
Mm-hmm.
And and I'm confident that I don't understand, and I'm confident that I need your help to understand it, from a communications perspective. So I think that those two would probably be the 2 that I would say I'm best known for in terms of communication style, I would say, and or things you would expect to get from me, as a communicator in the organization. I think there's two-edged swords to both of those.
Mm-hmm.
Because sometimes being, concise and direct can put people off, and so you need to be sensitive to that in terms of how direct, and or sometimes in the spirit of trying to be concise and direct, you leave out context, right? And so those
Absolutely.
have always been watch outs for me in terms of like, I want to be as direct and as short as I can, but at the same time, I want to make sure that it's not misunderstood,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that the context for why I'm presenting something or what I'm talking about or what the point I'm trying to get across is clear.
So just so you know, I think I'm going to steal what you did there when you said the question I asked was, what would you say? And then you turned it to, what would other people say about you? I really like that perspective. I think I'm going to take that moving forward for future guests. But yeah, this idea of conciseness and confidence, really powerful because people are busy. There's a lot going on. Folks don't have time all day, every day for soapboxes, as well as just reading lengthy emails that could have been handled a lot more efficiently. And with the confidence, that's so great that you mentioned confident that I don't know something, right? You're willing to go out there and ask that. Sometimes I would think a lot of times people would think of that as being a weakness. For me, that is a great show of strength and confidence that one, you're secure that you can do that, but for me, it's just a great leadership strategy to model for your teams, because the last thing that I want is my teams going out into the market in front of clients, doing whatever and winging it and guessing because they were afraid to ask that question. So as a leader, really showing that and modeling that if there is something you don't know enough about, or you want to learn more about this, or going into a new area, it's a huge thing to really be aware of and to work on. If you're leading people and leading organizations, being willing to say, I don't know, or I want to learn more about that.
Yeah, that's right. I think, that's sort of not a leadership discussion here, but I think that's also part of being, humble about the role that you're in. And
Mm-hmm.
as leaders, the farther up you get in the organization, sometimes the farther you get from the reality of what's actually happening. And recognizing
Yeah.
that is a super important leadership skill, right? Because the last
Yep.
thing you want to do is make a decision in a vacuum or again, without actually understanding. So yeah, I think that communications piece becomes really important. I think that the second thing that it does too is also sets the tone for your team that it's okay to not have all the answers,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then that we need to learn from each other. And part of what makes the team work really well is somebody's got to lead it. Okay, that's me. I get the privilege of that. But at the same time, I'm not the guy necessarily with all the expert answers,
Yeah.
right? So, and there are people with great ideas on the team, and those should be tapped, sought out, and heard as much as possible.
Yeah. Creating that strong team culture will pay dividends in the long run, where you have people that you can learn from. They're open and willing to learn and grow. It just kind of creates that flywheel effect, so to speak, where it just continues to pay off.
That's right.
So we have this concise, confident style. Who throughout your career or your life, Rob, really helped you to perhaps develop that style? Maybe who was somebody that influenced your communication style, and have you taken some things from folks and maybe tweaked a little bit to make your own?
Yeah, it's a good question around who. I think I've had the good fortune of being, in learning and development, I've always been closely aligned with the communications team. So I would think I would label it to a group of people more than an individual person. But I think that there's been a group of people, starting way back in the 90s when I first became a director in Bell South days, um, that have been really savvy experts on communication and have helped me in my communication skill, my communication style, my communications approach. Again, by going out and seeking feedback from them ahead of my actual communication, particularly on things that are super important, like where I'm trying to persuade somebody, or whether I'm trying to communicate difficult news, or whatever it might be, or even recognition, positive news. I think there's been good resources in the communications team that have been willing to just drop what they're doing and spend 5 or 10 minutes with me on just browse this and give me a couple of pointers on what I'm seeing. And I think that they're typically underestimated in an organization, and they're typically sort of boxed in a corner in an organization, except for maybe, you see them in investor relations, right, where it's more high stakes communications. But I think that those internal communications teams are really underleveraged in organizations as resources to help you as an individual be much more effective, right? Because they're studied in the craft. And and I can remember having a conversation with somebody, and they were like, let's just go back to what your intent is here, right? And they were a nice way of saying, I'm confused by what you're trying to say, I think, in retrospect. But it was like, let's just go back to what your intent was. And they deconstructed what I was saying in my message back to what my intention was. And it ended up being completely different and far more effective at the end than it needed to be. And that was literally 20 or 30-minute exercise over a lunch, right? Those kind of things. So I think that leaders and even individuals that are really, in some high stakes communications are really important to them. Communications opportunities should seek those people out as people they should build relationships with that can help them actually become more effective.
Yes, shout out to the corporate communications teams. They are a lot of times the unsung heroes at organizations, especially bigger companies, with the work that they do to really put effective messaging out, both internally and externally. And as I think about that, for me, one of the things that I always share, and I talk a lot about this with my kids, one of the best ways to really improve your communication skills is through reading. So if you're in a big organization, maybe you're not at the position where you're interacting with those communications teams, or you're able to get with them to have them review something. Read everything that comes out from your company. If you work at a big 10, 20, 100,000 employee company, you're routinely getting things in your inbox internally from your company. Read those things, because it helps to not only, one, grammatically strong messaging, but helps to really understand, how do I get my message across in a concise way, in a written format that comes across with the tone, ideally, that we're trying to achieve with this message. And if you don't work for a big organization, you have a small company, there's not a big comms team, read the things that you get from the organizations that you buy from. They're constantly sending out updates and messaging. Read through them. It'll absolutely help take your communication skills, both written and, I believe, verbal, to the next level.
Yeah, I think a good exercise too is I think about press releases as a good example of, like, if I don't work in a big company, I can still go out and read anybody's press release. I bet if you pulled 20 press releases and, sort of look at the construction of the message more than maybe what the words are saying, but look at how it's constructed, you could probably pull away a really good template that you could reuse yourself in almost any situation, right? And so there's plenty of resources out there to be able to take advantage of it if you really need to or want to own it, right? Again, you got to put the effort in, for sure.
Spot on. Rob, as we're wrapping up here, I want to be respectful of time. What advice would you have for somebody, whether they're fresh out of school, a budding entrepreneur looking to start their own business, or a professional that's mid-career and just ready to make a pivot, make a change? What advice would you have to them around the importance of developing strong communication skills?
Yeah, I think it's funny because I think that there's a spectrum, and you can put those audiences in different parts of the spectrum. So I think about people coming out of school, like my kids, and I'm like, never underestimate the importance of face-to-face and verbal communications. So while you're texting away, sometimes it's actually better if you pick up the phone and actually make a voice call, and you can be far more efficient, right? So I think about, right, you're laughing because you see the same thing I do.
Yes.
But I think that you can't underestimate the importance of that as a skill and as a dimension of your communications that you need to be, adept at. right? Because your world is never going to be just text messaging, right? Or instant messaging. You're going to have to stand in front of people and tell a story and persuade and have a conversation. And you're going to need to be successful in order to be successful, you need to be successful at doing that. So I think about that. And then I think, the other spectrum of it is, which has been a challenge for me is, across the years has been, how do you adapt to all these things digital that are coming down the pike, right? So how do I build my skill at, blogging, or even, being able to write a good post, or, or thinking about that. So a lot of startups that I work with, we talk about sort of how do you leverage, say, LinkedIn as your communication channel to the outside world to help you build customers. And, not as easy a skill as people might think. To do that. And, depending on your age, your orientation, your life experiences, even your cultural backgrounds, those are things that people need to embrace and work on and continually hone to get better. So I think across the spectrum, I'd say those two things, right? You have to be good at both the digital side of things, and now, you have to be good at the face-to-face things as well, if you overall really want to be known as and renowned as an effective communicator.
That's a fantastic perspective. Never really thought about it that way on the spectrum. As I think about through my personal experience, on the one end with the digital component, for the longest time, I had kind of kept social things like Instagram and TikTok at an arm's length, especially from the business perspective. But one of the goals for this year was to really start to learn more about how we can use it, how we can leverage it. And I will say, just in the time over the past couple of years, how I felt so out of the loop and somewhat overwhelmed getting into these platforms, trying to figure out how to use them. So I think it's always good to kind of keep your finger on the pulse as to what's going on from the technology and the digital side, and absolutely love it on that face-to-face side. So with my kids, we've always been big proponents, and I talk about this a lot. Like, if we go out to eat, whether it's at McDonald's or a sit-down restaurant, you're going to order your meal. You're going to talk to the waiter, the waitress. You're going to order. When we go to the doctor's office, you're going to answer the questions. You're going to talk to them. These are great skills, fantastic ways to get in reps, and not only reps of communication, but communicating with somebody where maybe you feel that they're in a higher up position than you or something like that. So it's just great skills. I really encourage folks, take these opportunities, because a lot of times the kids, they don't have that much. Like I said, they're buried in their phones or doing their TikToks and their texting and their Snapchats. Get them those opportunities inside in school and outside of school to get some practice in with face-to-face communication.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it can't be underestimated, because I think it is, it is a shortcoming right now coming out. I know I see it in, I see it sometimes in my kids in school and their ability to engage a teacher or whatever. They prefer to do it via email or text. And I'm like, why don't you actually go to the office and sit down and talk to them? And and ironically, when they do, they usually get a much better outcome, right? Because they start to build a relationship, and that relationship, builds caring and empathy. It's much easier, and your ability to influence gets much greater. So, yeah, it is very interesting. That's why I think of it as a spectrum, because I think to be really effective, depending on what your outcome is that you're going for, you have to be good at all of it.
Yeah.
It's not okay to just be good at one dimension of it.
Couldn't agree more. Rob, thank you so much for joining me today. Really, really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Scott, thank you. Look forward to seeing you soon.
All right, take care. A special thanks again to my guest, Rob Lauber. Rob's take on confidence and not knowing something is so important. By being willing to ask for help, not making decisions in a vacuum, and modeling the skill of saying, I'm not sure on that, can I get back to you? You create an environment where your teams feel safe doing the same thing and can avoid the pitfalls of just winging it. If you are looking to improve your communication skills, be sure to subscribe to Communicast so that you can continue to learn from my guests with each new episode. And if you have found value in the show, leaving us a rating or review would be appreciated. Thanks, and have a great day.